In a small town in the American Midwest, far from the big cities, was born on August 27, 1906, a man who would become synonymous with horror, Edward Theodore Gain. He grew up in La Crosse, Wisconsin, but it was in Plainfield, also in the same state, that he built the house that would later become the stage of one of the most shocking crimes in American history. His parents were Luther Gain and Augusta Holes Gain, harsh and extremely controlling people, especially his mother, who exerted a dominant influence over him. Augusta was deeply religious and constantly criticized Edward, saying that women were filthy and dangerous creatures. She isolated both her sons, Edward and his brother Henry, from the outside world so much that they barely had friends or social contact outside their own home. The relationship between mother and son was so sickly that many psychiatrists believe there were elements of emotional incest and pathological dependence. Meanwhile, his father was an alcoholic and often violent, which only increased the toxic environment inside the house. At school, Edward was the target of bullying and considered different by his classmates, which made him retreat even further into his internal world. Unlike his brother, who tried to integrate, Edward preferred the company of dead animals and old objects found on the family farm. Over time, he developed a morbid obsession with death and the human body, something that would surface decades later. His mother died in 1945 after suffering a hemorrhagic stroke, and this event marked a turning point in Edward's life. After her death, he plunged even deeper into his solitude, living alone in the old farmhouse. Without the maternal figure that once suffocated him, Edward began acting freely, without limits. It was there, in that extreme isolation, that he started exploring his darkest desires. Few imagined that behind that facade of a quiet and harmless man hid a psychopath in formation. After the death of his mother, Augusta, in 1945, Edward Gain began living alone on the family farm located in the quiet town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. The house, which was already geographically isolated, became literally a world apart, a dark kingdom where Edward could give free rein to his most disturbing thoughts. He stopped keeping regular contact with neighbors and rarely left home, except for small purchases or occasional jobs as a janitor and carpenter. During this period, Edward started collecting unusual objects, mostly things related to human bodies and death. Many locals considered him eccentric but harmless. Some even felt sorry for him, thinking he was still grieving his mother's loss. However, behind that facade of a lonely and shy man, a deeply disturbed mind was beginning to unfold. He obsessively read books about human anatomy, necrotic tissue, and taxidermy, mixing science with a twisted and distorted view of the human body. He also became interested in pagan rituals and ancient cultures that used body parts as symbols of power and renewal. He started visiting cemeteries frequently, often under the cover of night, observing recent graves and studying the natural processes of decomposition. His first contacts with corpses were discreet. He took bones and smaller pieces without drawing attention. Over time, these actions became bolder, and he began digging up entire bodies, taking them home in his old truck. Inside the farm, Edward created a homemade laboratory of horror, where he prepared and stored human remains. He developed basic taxidermy skills, stuffing dead animals and even trying to preserve human parts. This phase of total isolation was crucial for the advancement of his grotesque practices, as there was no one to question or stop his actions. Little by little, Edward Gain was transforming into something far beyond a simple eccentric. He was becoming a real monster. In the years following his mother's death, Edward Gain dove deeper into his dark universe until something within him seemed to break. He began leaving the farm at night, always alone, dressed in old and dirty clothes, driving his truck around Plainfield. His first known victim was Mary Hogan, a local housewife who mysteriously disappeared in December 1954. Mary owned a bar in town and had the habit of going for walks near the road, exactly near Edward's property. Her body was never officially found, but many investigators believe it was taken into Gain's house. At the time, no one suspected Edward, who maintained his image of a quiet and withdrawn man. But he didn't stop there. His obsession with bodies continued to grow, and he started visiting cemeteries regularly in search of new pieces. By the mid-1950s, Edward began exhuming graves, removing fresh corpses and taking them home. He stored them in different parts of the farm, treating them like actual study and cult objects. With his basic taxidermy skills, he prepared heads, hands, and other limbs, mounting them like trophies. In addition, he started having even more disturbing ideas. He wanted to create a woman's dress using human skin. For that, he needed whole bodies, not just bones or loose parts. And that need was growing inside him. Edward then started observing women in town, especially older ones who resembled his late mother. He was becoming a silent predator, studying his potential victims without anyone noticing. The isolation that once protected him now gave way to a sinister plan, and soon the world would discover the horror hidden behind the walls of that abandoned house. In November 1957, Edward Jr decided he was ready to move from exhuming corpses to something more direct, killing a person himself. His victim was Bernice Wardens, a 53-year-old woman who owned a drugstore in Plainfield, Wisconsin. Bernice was well known in town for her kindness and for being an important figure in the local commerce. She knew Edward superficially, as he often came to the store to buy cigarettes and some supplies. On November 16, 1957, Bernice closed the store early and went out to make a delivery. She was never seen alive again. In reality, Edward had followed her to an isolated spot on the road and attacked her violently. He took her body to his farm, where he decapitated her and began preparing parts of her body as if they were more of his morbid pieces. Unlike the bodies stolen from cemeteries, this one was fresh, and that made everything more real, more intense for Edward. Bernice's family quickly realized something was wrong when she didn't return home or open the store in the following days. Family members contacted friends and neighbors, and soon an informal investigation began within the community. Since the store was locked and no one knew where Bernice was, the police were officially called 2 days after her disappearance. Investigators began following leads and discovered that Edward Jr had been seen near the location where Bernice was last seen alive. One detail caught attention. He had bought gasoline hours before her disappearance, which seemed suspicious. Based on those clues, the police decided to visit Edward Jr.'s farm, an isolated and mysterious place. They had no idea they were about to find one of the most terrifying scenes in American criminal history. On the morning of November 16, 1957, investigators arrived at Edward Jr.'s farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, ready for what they thought would be a routine conversation. But upon entering that rundown house surrounded by weeds, the officers began to smell a strong and unpleasant odor in the air. The interior of the house was something between a dark museum and a nightmare laboratory. Strange objects, old utensils, and human body parts were everywhere. On the walls were masks made of human faces, including Bernice Wardens' face, hanging like a hunting trophy. Inside the kitchen, on the table, was her head, cleaned and prepared as if it were a piece of taxidermy. In the back room, the agents found a bedroom where Edward kept parts of female bodies, some still fresh, others already decomposing. There were also dresses and clothes made of human skin, including a skirt and a belt made from parts of his victims' bodies. In the basement of the house, the officers discovered a true workshop of horror. Blood-stained tools, scattered bones, and containers with human organs. A bucket contained several breasts, carefully preserved, and in a chair sat a torso without a head or limbs. In a drawer, they found dried male genitalia stored like relics. Everything indicated that Edward had been committing these crimes for years without anyone suspecting. Faced with that grotesque scene, the officers were shocked and nauseated. Some had to leave the house to breathe fresh air. Edward, on the other hand, seemed calm and even cooperative, answering questions calmly, as if he didn't understand the gravity of the situation. When asked about Bernice, he simply replied, "She's back there in the kitchen." That moment would mark the end of Edward Jr.'s isolation and the beginning of one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history. After the discovery of Bernice Wardens' body and the other horrors hidden on the farm, Edward Jr. was immediately arrested by the Plainfield police. He did not resist arrest and was taken without violence to the local station, where he began being questioned about his actions. During the initial interviews, Edward spoke calmly, as if telling an ordinary story, showing no remorse or regret. He confessed to killing Bernice but denied committing other murders, although the objects found in his house suggested otherwise. The investigators then began examining Edward's belongings more deeply, finding pieces that could belong to other victims. Many townspeople were shocked to learn that such a quiet and solitary man was capable of such cruelty. Authorities also started investigating previous disappearances in the area, suspecting that he might have committed other crimes. Based on the evidence found, Edward Gain was formally charged with homicide for Bernice Warden's death. However, his lawyer decided to use mental insanity as a defense, claiming that Gain was not fully aware of his actions. A psychiatric examination was conducted, and alarming diagnoses soon emerged. Edward suffered from multiple disorders, including severe psychopathy and a morbid obsession with the human body. In 1958, after months of investigations and medical analyses, Edward Gain was deemed legally insane, meaning he was incapable of criminally responsible behavior. Because of this, he was not sentenced to prison but instead admitted to Mendota State Hospital, a high-security psychiatric center in Wisconsin. It was the end of Edward Gain's freedom and the beginning of a long journey within the American psychiatric system. But even behind bars, the myth surrounding his figure would only grow over time. In 1958, Edward Gain was transferred to Mendota State Hospital, located in Madison, Wisconsin, an institution specialized in treating mentally ill criminals. There, he would undergo a series of psychological and psychiatric evaluations aimed at better understanding his disturbed mind. Doctors and specialists were both fascinated and frightened by Edward's reports, which described his actions with coldness and shocking detail. He spoke about corpses as if they were objects, without emotion, without guilt, almost as if he were describing museum pieces. During therapy sessions, Edward admitted he had a deep obsession with older women, especially those who reminded him of his mother, Augusta. This fixation was a direct reflection of the toxic relationship he had with her during childhood and adolescence, something that completely shaped his adult behavior. Doctors diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, severe psychopathy, and symptoms consistent with necrophilia and other serious mental disorders. Despite all these diagnoses, Edward rarely showed crises or violent behaviors inside the hospital. He was calm, cooperative, and even friendly with some staff members. That made everything even scarier, because it showed how well he could disguise himself when necessary. Over the years, he became a classic case study in forensic psychiatry and criminology. Many professionals visited the hospital just to interview him. His story was used as a basis for understanding serial killer profiles, especially those motivated by morbid obsessions and social isolation. Despite being institutionalized, Edward maintained sporadic contact with relatives and old neighbors, though few still wanted any connection with him. As time passed, his physical health began to decline, but his mind remained sharp, holding secrets no one could ever truly understand. Meanwhile, outside the hospital walls, his fame continued to grow, becoming almost legendary. And that legend, fueled by the press and writers, would begin to generate unexpected inspirations for the world of cinema and literature. Even while interned in a psychiatric hospital, far from the spotlight, Edward Gain's story began to gain strength in the media and among horror writers. His obsession with bodies, his lonely personality, and his barbaric crimes became a source of inspiration for some of the most frightening figures in pop culture. One of the first major hits influenced by him was the film Psycho, released in 1960, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. The character Norman Bates, owner of an isolated motel with a morbid relationship with his mother, bore strong similarities to Edward's real life. Although not a direct adaptation, the director and screenwriter based themselves on various real-life serial killers, and Edward was among the main names studied. Years later, in 1974, came the horror classic The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, whose villain Leatherface had habits similar to Gaines, such as using human skin as a mask. The creators of the film stated that the inspiration came directly from reports about Edward and his woman's dress made of human skin. Perhaps the biggest reference came decades later, in 1991, with the film The Silence of the Lambs. The character Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins, is one of the most iconic villains in cinema, And many experts point out that Edward Gain was a major inspiration. Like Edward, Hannibal was cultured, cold, calculating, and had a morbid fascination with the human body, although his profile was more refined. Besides these, several other films, series, and books used elements taken from Edward Gain's life to create new fictional monsters. He became an archetype of extreme insanity, mixing childhood trauma, social isolation, and obsession with death. Despite his crimes, which were terrible, his name remains remembered as one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history. But while Hollywood turned his story into entertainment, Edward remained confined, far from the fame that his shadow had generated. After decades of being interned at Mendota State Hospital, Edward Gain spent his final years away from society, surrounded only by doctors, guards, and his own mind. As time passed, his physical health began to deteriorate. He suffered from cancer and other complications related to old age. Even with all the crimes he had committed, he was never tried again, as he continued to be considered mentally unfit. In his hospital room, he led an extremely peaceful life, causing no problems or drawing attention. Some staff members reported that he was polite, answered questions calmly, and sometimes even joked lightly with those around him. But this apparent normality sharply contrasted with the terrible stories he told about himself during evaluation sessions. Edward never showed real remorse for his victims or the horrors he had caused. To him, everything seemed like part of a natural ritual. In 1984, at the age of 77, he was transferred to Waupun Correctional Center after being deemed physically too frail to remain at Mendota. There, he spent his final years in a semi-hospital setting, receiving constant medical care but with no chance of freedom. During this period, he became even more withdrawn, speaking little and maintaining minimal contact with other inmates. On July 21, 1984, Edward Theodore Gain died from complications due to esophageal cancer. His body was cremated and his ashes buried in St. John's Cemetery in Plainfield, Wisconsin, the same place where many of his victims rested. His death brought no comfort to the families of the victims, who would carry forever the pain left by his actions. To the world, Edward Gain left a dark legacy, not only as a criminal but as a classic case of extreme insanity and obsession. His story continues to be studied by experts, remembered by true crime fans, and revisited by filmmakers, a name that will never be forgotten in the history of real horror. Decades after his death, the name of Edward Gain is still synonymous with horror and fascination for millions of people around the world. His crimes, although limited in number, had a huge impact on how the world understands the mind of a psychopath. Unlike other serial killers who acted for pleasure or control, Edward was driven by deep obsessions and an extreme mental disorder. He didn't kill for revenge or desire for power. He killed to try to reconstruct something he had lost: his mother. This unusual and disturbing motivation made him one of the most studied cases in forensic psychiatry. Even today, specialists analyze his actions to better understand the mechanisms behind social isolation, childhood trauma, and necrophilia. His influence on cinema and literature is undeniable. Characters like Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Hannibal Lecter clearly carry traces of his personality. But beyond that, Edward became a symbol of the fear of the unknown, the quiet neighbor hiding unimaginable secrets. His story reminds us that evil doesn't always come shouting or threatening. Sometimes it knocks on your door politely and with a calm smile. The case of Edward Gain continues to be the subject of documentaries, books, movies, and even theater plays, showing that his legacy remains alive. For many, he represents the scariest aspect of human nature, the combination between the ordinary and the monstrous. His farm in Plainfield was demolished years later, but even today, those who pass near the site feel an inexplicable chill in the air. And so, Edward Gain lives not only in the pages of criminal history, but also in the shadows of our own minds. A lonely man, a silent killer, a monster masked as a human. That is the true face of real terror. If you've made it this far, did you enjoy this dive into the darkest side of real history? Then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with more stories that will keep you up at night. If you enjoyed this content, leave in the comments, "I want more videos like this." And don't forget to share with someone who loves true crime. Let's keep exploring the mysteries behind the greatest cases in history.